Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get seated and start this very wonderful session. May I take this opportunity to welcome you to this very important discussion this afternoon? Yes, we are gathered here at the UAE to discuss a number of things, but I'm very much aware that the issue around financing food systems in the face of climate is a very, very critical discussion. We've all discussed and heard in the global media and the global discussions around financing food systems on the continent. But I think one of the most innovations that we have had is how the UAE presidency has profiled food system in the climate discussions. I think this is one of the fundamental changes we've seen in the whole climate discussions. But what is coming out very clear also is the whole financing aspect. We've really scanned around and looked for the amount of resources that are going to food system investments as well as climate. It is some extent significant, but it's not enough. So today we are gathered to discuss one of those innovations and areas that we can begin to see what is the evidence available to tell us what is actually happening in the global world and how can we really mobilize the global community to tap into these particular opportunities. So I'm really glad to have this discussion. I'm happy to see that people have been able to put their brains and minds together to bring this topic to bear. And with that, I want to really start by identifying that we have three key main objectives in 1 hour that we have. We want to make sure that we are taking stock of the state of the climate and sustainable financing in food and agriculture. We also want to end this session by making sure that we are identifying concrete solutions from industry leaders to mobilize financing at scale and making sure that we are transitioning food systems towards sustainability. A very, very clear objective. Then thirdly, we want to identify pathways to the banking industry to transition towards green financing portfolios. Because this has been some of the mismatches we've seen in the global discussions. And I'm happy to start this by inviting some of our key speakers. Lucas, who is going to be giving an opening remarks, is physically not here, but will be giving opening remarks remotely. And I would like to invite the team to put the video for Lucas to give us welcome remarks. Lucas, over to you.
Good afternoon to all. I'm very pleased to open this side event on pioneering evidence-based finance instruments for systems transformation. I am very sorry my dates in COP did not coincide with this important conversation, but it's good to be here with you virtually. It's also important to see food systems transformation is becoming more central in this COP and others such as the biodiversity convention. We are here because we know food systems are central to put us back on track towards a net zero, resilient, and nature positive economy. In fact, about a third of global emissions are food and ag related, and the food and ag sector is also the main driver of biodiversity loss. But at the same time, the sector is the most exposed to climate change, and many of the world's most vulnerable people depend on agriculture production for their survival. In a nutshell, without drastically transforming our food systems, there is no decent future in sight. The good news, and this is speaking on behalf of CGIAR, but also advanced research institutes, national systems, academia, the private sector, is that there are technologies and solutions that are ready to be deployed for our food systems to become more sustainable, more resilient, and also to generate revenues of investors and partners alike. Their adoption is critical for de-risking, for example, the agricultural activity. A new bean seed, a new bean variety that can better withstand higher temperatures or longer dry spells adds resilience to farming communities and secures nutritious food when it reaches consumers, lowering the risk of a failing crop. So adoption of climate and nature smart technologies requires, however, massive investment. And as you will be later shown by our colleague from CPI, we're far from hitting the mark. The investment gap in food and ag is due to many factors, including the lack of bankable and climate-smart pipelines, the fragmentation of the sector, and the perceived risks. There is therefore a need to find concrete solutions to help investors manage risks, but also maximize the impacts they create through their investments. And this is precisely what the CGIAR is committed to, among others, through the CGIAR Hub for Sustainable Finance. Today, we will present, together with partners, including from the British International Investment, NORAD, the Climate Bonds Initiative, Finagro, and IFAD, concrete solutions to rapidly achieve a paradigm shift in terms of food systems transformation. There is work ahead of us, but there is a way forward. And as Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it is done. I hope we all profit from this important event.
Can we give Lucas a clap of hands? I'm sure he's listening to us and is happy to hear that we appreciate his comments. And I should have mentioned that Lucas is the Director General Alliance by the First International CIAT. He's also a Global Director Partnerships and Advocacy at the CGIAR. I should have mentioned that. So we have another remarks from Daniela Chirac, who is a Manager Climate Policy Initiative, who is also going to make remarks, and she is not here, right? Can we play Daniela's?
It's a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you.
My name is Daniela Kiyak. I'm a manager at Climate Policy Initiative, where I lead the Secretariat for the Climate Short Investor Coalition, or CLIC. CLIC, we aim to rapidly scale up the finance necessary to shift towards low carbon, climate resilient, and nature positive agriculture and food systems. And today I'm here to give you a very brief overview of some key findings from our recent publication called The Landscape of Climate Finance for Agri-Food Systems. So first, let us have a look at the big picture. For 2019-2020, we tracked 28.5 billion US dollars in annual average of climate finance that was flowing to agri-food systems. And this represents only 4.3% of the total climate finance that was committed globally across sectors. So it strikes us as a disproportionately low on a number of levels. Agri-food systems are responsible for approximately 1/3 of the anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, and they are also highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. They also play a central economic role, especially in developing economies, where they contribute over 20% of GDP, not to mention that they're essential for world's food security. Also, to put that in a cross-sectoral perspective, for the same period, energy systems received 51% of the total climate finance, and transport received 26%. So it becomes clear to us that there's an urgent need to increase and also improve the climate financial resources directed to agri-food systems. So on this slide, you can see how the current level of climate finance, represented in green, compares with the estimated amounts that are needed for the climate transition in agri-food systems, which are represented in the orange columns. So it shows that even to match the most conservative scenario, we need at least a 7-fold increase from 2019-2020 levels. So this points to the need for strategic restructuring of the current agri-food funding in order to enhance climate interventions. For instance, this can come from public agriculture and fishery subsidies, which are currently estimated to amount around 670 billion US dollars per year, but which include a significant share that supports harmful practices. There's also an existing pool of private capital, roughly estimated at around 630 billion annually, and which is available for investments in agri-food systems and which could be designed to deliver climate benefits. So on this last slide, we have an overview of the sources of finance by region. You can notice that public entities contribute a large majority of 85% of the climate finance to agri-food systems. In comparison, public entities provided only 33% of climate finance for energy systems during the same period. So this points again to a need for a more determined use of public funding in a catalytic way in order to attract private investments. With this, I conclude my presentation. Thanks so much for your attention, and please get in touch if you have any questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Irak. I think for me, the major message from her presentation is around the lack of attention to financing climate smart related investments. And I think the numbers are so clear out there. I'm sure we'll get more evidence that speak to this particular issue. Now, as we gather into the more discussions, I have the opportunity to invite my colleagues to present additional evidence in much more detail that will be able to amplify the issue. Godfrey Grosjean and Richard Newman, who are going to share with us some of the deep analytics that have gone into this work. Again, for me, the point is, where is the evidence? What is the evidence telling us? And where are the solutions that we can be able to respond to the challenges that we're able to see? So I have the opportunity and the honor to invite Richard and Godfrey to present to us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Boaz, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon, and let me just... There is a small technical issue here. Which one? Okay. Thanks a lot. Sorry, apologies for that. So it's a real pleasure to be here today and present basically the strategies of Impact SF and the CGIAR for catalyzing mainstream and frontier investment for food systems transformation. So it was eloquently highlighted by Daniela Chirac and Juan Lucas Restrepo earlier. We need massive investments if we want to transform food systems and achieve net zero, nature positive targets. Now, we believe that although the challenge is ahead of us, there are big business opportunities for both investors and farmers if we do that right and if we invest scale in food systems. Now, to achieve that, it will require acting through different leverage points. And those are some that we have been working specifically on, starting with mainstream investments. We see essentially two types of investment approach and investment strategies to achieve, to mobilize finance. One is through value chain finance. So essentially working through large actors in value chains and basically through those actors pull the other actors, small other farmers, other agri SMEs from that value chain to basically scale climate smart technologies and strategies. Now this can work, but this will work most likely only in very structured value chains that are very organized. And the challenge is that in many developing emerging markets, value chains are not structured, and there are millions of farmers that are not part of that and then could not benefit from this kind of financing. Now, those smallholder farmers, the entry point to access financing is usually through financial institutions, banks, microfinance institutions. Now, banks very often are very reluctant to lend to the agriculture sector because they perceive this as too risky. So basically, if we find solutions to help banks and other financial institutions manage the risk of their lending operations, we could potentially deploy and mobilize finance for millions of smallholder farmers globally. Now, beyond mainstream investments, big changes are also needed in terms of technologies, etc., in the agriculture sector and food sector. So we need also more frontier types of investments, technologies that are not yet deployed at scale for the moment, like biochar, or a very specific thematic like biodiversity that have not been proven in terms of investment case at scale so far. So we need for that patient capital to allow prove the business case and then take it towards mainstream. So now I hand over the mic to my colleague Richard, who will go through some of the examples of the work we're doing on those different aspects. Over to you, Richard.
Great. Thanks very much, Godfrey. It's a real pleasure being here. So yeah, I'm going to take you through specific examples that we've currently co-developing investment products with partners. So the first one, and that is under thematic focus area. This is the Amazon Biodiversity Fund. This is the first fund supported by the CGIAR. Here we provided support in terms of the design of the fund, but also provide technical advisory. This fund is very pioneering because it invests in solutions that address both the climate and the nature crisis in the Amazon specifically. As described by Godfrey, as described by Godfrey, these are solutions that really we need to prove the business case and prove to mainstream investors that we can invest in complex and challenging topics, but also generate financial return. The next fund I would like to describe is under technology theme. This is quite new. So recently, together with investment manager Big Valley, we were awarded a design grant by Convergence to design an ag waste climate fund. And really, the central theme of this is biochar as a solution to valorize ag waste and decarbonize our value chains. This, of course, brings mitigation benefit, but it also has co-benefits in terms of adaptation, improved soil health, for example. These type of technologies need a patient, long-term capital to really prove the business case for the market. The next fund I would like to show as an example is under the value chain theme, and this is the Climate Smart Food System Fund. This fund was co-designed with Responsibility, an asset manager out of Switzerland. It's a blended finance debt fund providing long-term expansion debt to agri-SMEs that really promote climate smart strategies in their business models. The fund invests across the food system from upstream, midstream, and downstream, and invests according to the pillars of climate smart agriculture. So that is climate mitigation, adaptation, and productivity benefits. So as described by my colleague Godfrey earlier, these are entities that really have in more structured value chains that can really pull actors with them. Just to highlight an example, so a pipeline company under this fund is a large organic agro-processor in East Africa. The company is looking for expansion debt to increase capacity, currently sourcing from 20,000 smallholder farmers and really promoting good agricultural practices with those farmers. With expansion debt, the company can then increase its capacity and support 50,000 farmers. And these are examples of the type of companies under this fund. I'll now hand over to Godfrey to talk through the final fund and then also talk about some of the technology, software technology that we are developing. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Richard. And then, as we said earlier, so financial institutions can really play a key role in unlocking finance for smaller farmers. And this is exactly why, as the Impact SF CGI Hub for Sustainable Finance, we decided to take the lead in co-created a blended finance structure, 250 million target. So it's our largest initiative so far to provide green loans to financial institutions to increase the lending for climate adaptation. And this is highly innovative through three different lenses. Of course, one aspect is the blended finance structure to help de-risk the investment. But then on top of that, we adding two other components. One is technical assistance to the banking sector to basically help banks integrate ESG risk and impact in their lending operations and advise the farmers they lend to in terms of what are the climate smart agriculture practices and solutions they can implement, so to help them mitigate and manage those risks. And finally, we're bringing a pipeline of banks we're currently working with to basically test a suite of solutions for risk management that I present in a second in 5 countries globally, and that will be part of the pipeline that we're building for that specific fund. Now, this proprietary software and suite of solutions that we're bringing and that will be included in that fund is based on 3 key components. The first one is spatially explicit ESG risk and impact assessment. And I will explain in a second in more details what it is. Then a company level ESG scorecard that feed into portal level dashboard overview for the investor. So very rapidly. So the first component is a tool, especially explicit ESG risk and impact assessment, that basically with very limited input provides to a bank, a loan officer, an understanding of a location-specific risk but also forecasts of potential productivity impacts linked to climate change. And then it brings to the user also a set of recommendations in terms of how to manage those specific risks in that specific value chain in that specific location. Now, beyond that, we go one step further, really providing a scorecard at company level of to assess what the company is doing that, for instance, a bank would lend money to. What the company is doing at the moment in terms of ESG, what the risks they are facing, but what are the impact they're generating, and what sort of additional impact as a company they could generate. And that goes beyond the production level. It's not which was more the focus on the previous slide. It's across the value chain. And then finally, all of that feeds into a dashboard, as I was saying, that helps the investors, think a bank or a fund, to really have a very good overview of what is the ESG risk and impact they're generating through their portfolio. Now, we're really convinced that through these solutions and the blended finance structure that I mentioned, there is really a potential to unlock finance at scale for smallholders and for adaptation, which is at the moment, as we saw earlier, one of the big gaps in terms of climate finance. So this is a way to connect large pool of capitals, and maybe some sitting in this city we're in today, so large scale investors to smaller farmers, and then hopefully make what is often perceived impossible done in a couple of years. So thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to the questions and the discussions later.
We are now going to transition into a real deep discussions, and I will be engaging you more as you're part of the audience. But before we engage into the discussions, I would really be able to first have a panel of discussions, and please allow me to take the opportunity to invite the panelists and we'll sit in front here. Can somebody help us rearrange the tables so that we can be able to see the panelists here? I'll invite you. So let me take the opportunity to invite the panelists. The first one is Uja, who is the Director of Strategy and Programs, the Climate Bonds Initiative. Welcome to the panel. Second member of the panel is Nick. Nick, who is the Chief Executive Officer and the member of the British International Investment Board. Welcome, Nick, to the panel. And the third member of the panel is none other than Pa. Is Pa here? Oh yeah, you're here. Pa, and allow me to stop there because the rest of the name I will mention it. But Pa is from Norway and is a director of NORAD's Department for Climate and Environment, and therefore brings a lot of effort and volume of thinking around how to identify innovative solutions for financing food systems and climate. And so you can see we have a very, very rich panel. And I will start with the UPA. And my first question is really share with people who are online, people who are in the audience here, the vision that you have and your organization has around identifying these new solutions for financing climate or food system related issues that are linked to the climate agenda. What is the vision? What do you have for people to understand? And then I'll be making up follow-up questions.
All right, that works. Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much, and welcome everybody. Thanks for having me here. It's really a privilege and obviously an essential discussion. The interfinancing of these activities are obviously in the billions of dollar scale, and finding new ways of doing it is quite essential. So for us, getting more finance into climate smart agriculture, equitable climate smart agriculture in particular in sub-Saharan Africa is on top of our agenda, and that means, given that we have limited resources, that we need to be better at deploying it. Now, partly that, of course, is done through some relatively traditional things like building capacity, policy, advocacy, and support, fostering innovation and technology, and strengthening partnerships. But on this occasion, I think I'm going to focus on one particular fund, but also the thinking behind it. Clearly, as we saw from the slide from Daniela, the amount of private finance is very minuscule in this space, and the question, of course, is how do we deal with that? The sector is viewed as risky, as was pointed out. Investors are apprehensive about financing. So clearly, concessional financing to offtake risk is crucial. Now the question is how to do that. You had several alternatives, proposals, existing live examples up there. The one example I would like to use is a fund that's been was launched at the UNGA by USAID and NORAD, which we like to think is innovative. As Samantha Powell said at the launch, it's a big idea launched within a medium-sized fund. It's called the FASA fund. The capitalization goal for the concessional part is 200 million. The stretch target for leverage is 5x, so to a billion or so for starters. Now, what's new about this fund, we think, and what we hope is gonna prove to be breakthrough, is that the fund as such is purely first loss, and what it does is it specializes in picking smaller investment funds that target certain value chains and geographies, or put another way, know what they're doing, which is crucial if we're going to take down the risk. A lot of this risk is real, some of it is perceived. In either case, having specialized investment managers assessing that risk and dealing with it is crucial. So what the FASA fund will do, and the call for proposals for fund manager are out today, so have a look if you want to. What they will specialize in is actually picking the fund managers and then inserting a proportion of first loss capital that will in turn enable, obviously, development finance institutions, but also private investors to come in at the how to put it, an acceptable risk return profile. As I said, this is targeted at sub-Saharan Africa. It's targeting a segment that usually fall between those that are sort of microfinance size and those that are big enough for larger investors to deal with them. So, yeah, some 100,000 type sized investment funds, and no million, sorry, but they in turn are targeting those sectors that are that required the missing middle of finance. The reason why we're doing this is that the analysis is that essentially the main impediment for growth for a very large proportion of small farmers in sub-Saharan Africa is access to finance and the ability to interact with supply chains. They're simply not financed to interact with supply chains. These small and medium businesses can do that, but they in turn are also undercapitalized, or if they can get capital, it's simply too expensive to do the trick. So that's the sketch. We do believe that it targets a crucial segment. We do believe that the way we approach it is a good starting point for handling the very real and perceived risks in the sector in the best possible way. And we are actively, of course, seeking other co-donors, but we have already secured 70 billion in pure first risk from USAID and Norway. And as I said, the call for proposal is out for fund manager.
The proposal is out. Just maybe before you leave that part, can you explain the geographical coverage, which countries, which regions? Is it a global coverage? Just quickly.
It's sub-Saharan Africa, broadly. Yep, there are some. I mean, both USAID and Norway have some countries that we work with that are going to be, that we want this fund to invest in. And there are certain that are with limits for reason I'm not going to go into, but it's basically sub-Saharan Africa. The reason we keep it that open, of course, is that we wanted to be able to move quickly, find good investment managers. So a large geographical scope is a good way to get started and also diversify risk.
Thank you so much. We'll be coming back to you for some more questions. But let me turn to Nick from the British International Investment. And Nick, share with us your vision for especially mobilizing this financing at scale. And also you could touch also on this on the coverage and how much this fund would look like. We would really welcome the initiative that you've started. Maybe starting with that as an appreciation from me. But share with us the vision that you have and how you are going to be doing this, responding to these challenges.
Thanks both, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here, and as other speakers have said, this is really such a critical subject, both in terms of the overall development agenda and reaching the SDGs, but also in terms of addressing climate change. I'll just say a quick word about BII. We are the UK's development finance institution. We're an organisation that was formerly known as CDC. And we have, under that name, we've been, we're in fact the world's first development finance institution when we were founded in 1948. And throughout its history, BII or CDC has always food and agriculture and investing in food and agriculture and investing through private sector in food and agriculture, which is all that we really do, has always been very significant, has been a significant part of our portfolio, and that continues today. We have invested across the whole agriculture finance chain. We've invested in production. We've invested in inputs like fertilizers and seeds, pesticides. We've invested in processing. We've invested in trading. So across the whole value chain, over a long period of time, we've been active. Because what has changed, I suppose, over the last decade is a much more focus on what are called climate smart agriculture. And that is has some overlap with what we've been doing before, but it's not quite the same thing. And absolutely true that, as previous speakers have said, that climate finance or investment in agriculture makes up a very small part of climate finance. The thing we have to be a little bit careful, though, not to be it's not as much about how much finance is going, it's what type of finance is going. So, for example, you compare investing in agricultural systems to, say, energy systems or transport systems. Of course, agricultural systems are going to be a small part of that because they're not capital heavy. They don't require massive amounts of capex, which tends to be what capital is required for. The solutions in agriculture require much more innovation. It requires companies that really have an appetite in the financing to grow. That takes a particular type of finance. It takes equity finance. It takes unsecured lending by banks. And so those are really the areas that I think we need to focus on. And a number of the number of funds that we've been shown by Godfrey and by Richard, by Per, have been focused on that end of the market. High risk equity and lending through financial intermediaries such as banks to be and in an unsecured way. But one of the huge challenges that farmers have is they don't have any security that they can put up. For many banks, particularly in developing markets, all they do is lend against security. So you don't have any, you're not going to get any money. So how do we provide facilities to banks that allow them and encourage them to do more unsecured lending? I think is a huge part of this. For us at BII, I think there's two particular issues that we focus on. One is this question of high risk pools of capital, and how do we support funds really are providing the type of capital that these organizations need, will help them grow, will help them scale. And I can maybe come back later and talk a little bit about some of the more specific pools. And then the other one, I think, is partnership with organizations that aren't just investment firms. We have an MOU that we've done with Shell Foundation, for example, where we recently did an investment in a company called Sun Culture. It was almost the first time, I think, that we partnered directly in that way with really a foundation. So I think those two things, for us, in doing more and playing a bigger part in addressing this issue, is really about those two things: higher risk pools of capital, and we're very fortunate with our shareholder in providing them, and greater partnership and collaboration with foundations, other philanthropic organizations.
Thanks so much, Nick. And I think what I pick from you is that you're challenging that it's not just the numbers, the amount may not be just the most important, but kind and the nature and the type of investment where these resources are going to. What is the innovation that we're talking about?
Yeah, it's exactly right. What we need is innovation, we need growth, we need scaling. This is not about huge capex, and that energy is about huge capital expenditure. Transport systems are about huge capital expenditures if we're going to transition them if we're transitioning to net zero. But agriculture is much more. It's about innovation. It's often about smaller companies. It's about greater risk taking, and it is about more availability of philanthropic funding to support.
There isn't sufficient evidence about what are the innovations that are working already. I think the presentation that were made by colleagues is beginning to tell us that some of these innovations are coming.
Yeah, no,
Maybe we'll transition into mobilizing the amount now when we get the innovations correct.
I think we'll only know if the innovations are working over time. I mean, we've done investments in sort of smaller solar irrigation systems funded with carbon credits. We've done investments in crop insurance, and they're promising. You don't really. We hope that they'll be effective, that they'll and they can be sort of scaled and replicated in other countries. But it does take time.
Good, thank you so much. Let me turn Ujala, you Director Ujala, the Climate Bonds Initiative. I think your work in the strategy and the programs and the entire initiative, what it's doing is very, very important. The name and the title of this initiative is attractive for me and for many out there. Share with us the vision that you're having, and then later we'll discuss into some of these. Do funds, will the amounts matter? Or the innovations need to be really upfronted? But speak to the initiative that you have and the vision that you have, and then I'll be following up with some more questions.
Should I? Oh, no, no problem. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. And before I answer the question, I just wanted to comment on the slide that you all showed of the CGIAR fund. And I just really appreciated the sort of smorgasbord of solutions, because I think often we want to try to solve these problems with one silver bullet or one type of solution. And I think that the spectrum of the different needs, financial needs, are really important to recognize and then design financial instruments and approaches that are appropriate for the different stages of development of the companies or of the different investments. So just wanted to shout out that I love that and I took a picture of it. And I want to talk more. But in terms of climate bonds, so Climate Bonds Initiative is a non-for-profit. We're focused on mobilizing debt capital markets for climate solutions. What is our vision? Our vision is, well, first of all, there is enough money in the world to solve these problems. And I think that's the first thing that we recognize in our sort of vision and our theory of change. There's $120 trillion of capital sitting in just in debt capital markets and institutional institutional investors, not to mention the broader capital markets. So we have the money, but the money is not flowing and it's not flowing to the right types of things. So part of the problem, there's many barriers, but part of the problem is that there's a lack of clarity on where that money should flow and lack of standardized definitions. And I think it's very important that we have definitions that are working for all the different stakeholders in the value chain, and in terms of and as well as all the different stakeholders from both the investment perspective but also the issuer and the project perspective. So if we have interoperable standards for the finance sector is using, the banks are using, that governments are using, and that issuers are using, it eases the flow of capital. But if everybody's using a different framework or a different standard, or one person's ESG is one thing and another person's ESG is another thing, then we have a problem. So that's part of what Climate Bonds Initiative does, is we help to develop those standards. And we not only do that through our own we have a standards and certification scheme through which we certify green bonds. So that's one way that we help with the market. But another way is actually there are currently, I think, 30 countries in the world that are developing national sustainable finance taxonomies. So it started with the EU and China. Well, I think China was the first, and then the EU. And now there's been a snowball effect where there's taxonomies popping up all over the world. These taxonomies should have agriculture integrated into them, because that's going to help, again, to signal to the market that governments are looking for investments in agriculture and agri-food. So that's another thing that Climate Bonds supports. We work with governments to help align their taxonomies, to help them come up with criteria and metrics for those taxonomies. And what's really important again on that is interoperability. Because one of the main purposes of a taxonomy is to attract international capital markets. But if they don't all speak to each other, international capital markets want to be able to flow kind of without the boundaries. So they need to be interoperable as well. But that's where the challenge comes, because it's very context specific. So how do you meet that challenge of needing a global standard but then also needing context specific standards? So that's another, I think, area that we really work hard on trying to understand. If we have common principles and common approaches, but then underneath those more granular, context specific, nationally relevant metrics and benchmarks and standards. Um, so yeah, that's what we do on definitions, and
Yeah,
I'll stop there.
yeah. But just before you stop, do countries understand what these standards are? Because in many cases, when you are, and I agree with you, the global standards, but also context-specific standards. Do countries, do players, do businesses understand these standards to be able to tap into these opportunities?
No, some of them do, but not enough. And I think that's part of the job is for all of us, I think, who are trying to help farmers and companies and actors across the supply chain and value chain to access finance. These definitions need to be well understood. And I think the other challenge with the definitions is they need to be expansive enough to include both mitigation, adaptation. They have to be able to encompass the different challenges that the sector faces. So currently, what we do have are very green focused definitions, and that often doesn't speak to the needs. The needs are not just about low emissions, they're also about having resilient agri-food systems. And so those definitions have to start incorporating that. And that's another area that we're currently working on, is developing adaptation and resilience standards for the agri-food sector as well as the green side.
That's extremely helpful, because when you talk about you beginning to work on really helping interpret and also make sure that those definitions are understood, and differentiating between mitigation and adaptation. And this is a question that I want to take back to Pa Frederick from Norway. The whole debate and discussion around adaptation and mitigation. There's been a lot of discussions around, should we be paying more attention to adaptation? Should we be paying more attention to mitigation? About those who don't have any power to mitigate whatever is happening because they don't have the control. In Africa, where I come from, I remember the African Union had a common position on for climate change agenda. Adapt, because you cannot mitigate what you are not largely responsible for. Although we begin to see a lot of actions, so intensifying agricultural production productivity, the likelihood that can be contributing to the climate challenge is high. But tell us from Norway and where you are coming from, what are you thinking about whole adaptation agenda? What are the vision? What is the thinking around the adaptation that you promote, which I think is very important, but also against the kind of mitigation issues that we've been able to hear from others?
Yeah, thank you. it's the right question. I think just to cover the mitigation first, when we talk about adaptation, I think we should be very clear that adaptation as a concept is mainly interesting in a setting where we actually deliver on the Paris mitigation goals. Runaway climate change can't be adapted to. We're going to be in an unmanageable world, essentially. So the mitigation has to be done, and fully agree. Africa has very little historical responsibility and very low per capita emissions, and that's not where you solve that question mainly. But another way of looking at it is that in many ways these agendas are they can be dealt with holistically. And I would say in the food systems sector, that's particularly true. The sort of no-brainer example is our ability to avoid deforestation and take care of our soils. Both of those things are crucial for adaptation, and they're crucial for mitigation because of the carbon storage, and they're crucial for general resilience. So promoting agricultural practices that do all these things is essentially at the heart of what we're trying to do. But clearly, in particular, where people are living at relatively low income levels, then of course resilience and robustness in the face of climate change is the most crucial thing, the resilience and adaptation part. And we come at that in different ways. We are working on the insurance side. We're working on the seed side in terms of what are climate resilient varieties, all kinds of this well-known set of practices, agroecological and so on, that makes crops more resilient, but also in early warning systems to get ahead of climate-driven crises and dealing with them. So we gotta get at this from various angles, and it has to be priority number one, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. But I think the big picture takeaway is we need the transformation of our food systems that go from consumers in the north and down to the farmer that needs access to all the inputs and the supply chains, needs access to climate resilient practices and seeds and so on, needs accesses to the social safety nets and the insurance and the early warning that enables them to deal with these situations as they arise. And all this has to be done in the context of delivering on the mitigation goals, because if we don't do that, all the adaptation will be, well,
because when you talk about it has been brought in the context specific situation. For a smallholder farmer in southwestern Uganda, a country I come from, facing with a very small piece of land, just next is a huge wetland, it's a huge forest. And the activists are saying if you cut this particular forest, you are really exacerbating the climate challenge. It is a person whose next meal is going to come from an additional piece of land. So when you're talking about mitigation against adaptation, and you're talking about putting it much into context, solutions that are available out there, and the nature and the type of information, talking about the evidence, for these people to be able to be resilient and build their capability to respond to that challenge, it's so huge. Understand? But let me just come back to you, Nick. And I know it's a big discussion and big debate, but I really like the fact that there are some thoughts being put here. Nick, you talked about a number of things, but I wanted to hear from BI Initiative how you are addressing new pools of capital. For example, the kinetic initiative that we've talked about to catalyze the climate financing flows. Because I think these are some of the new emerging models and tools that we can be able to see and how that works.
Yeah, I talked earlier about. I guess I made the point that it's of course it's about the quantity of finance, but it's not just about the quantity of finance. It's about the type of finance that's made available, and specifically it's about the risk tolerance of the finance that's made available. And one of the challenges, I've been in the impact investment area for a long time long before I joined BII, and I feel like the impact investment movement made a lot of promises about how they were going to, invest and create positive change, particularly in Africa. If you look at what's happened, very little has happened. And the reason very little has happened is because there's a perception, or much of the industry has sold itself as being able to generate market rate returns. So you can earn the same risk adjusted return investing in small companies or in providing goods and services to small farmers in Africa, or unsecured lending to small farmers. You can make the same sort of risk adjusted returns that you can in the United States or Europe. And it's simply not true. That's one of the reasons why so little capital has been made available. So you have to have a more flexible approach to risk. We are at BII are fortunate. We have one shareholder, and that's the UK government, and they have recognized this, and they have made separate pools of capital available. So we have a very traditional, we're called a growth portfolio, which is much more is much similar to the traditional DFI portfolio. Then we have two other portfolios. One is called Catalyst, where the intention is if you get your money back, that's fine. We don't have to feel that we have to earn a substantial return. And then we have another pool of money which we received about a year ago, 240 million pounds over 3 years, which is called Kinetic, which is really aimed at going after the really climate innovation, looking for those things. And I mentioned, pre-funding crop insurance, which we do through a company called Pula, solar irrigation, which we're doing together with the Shell Foundation, with Sun Culture. Those are investments that really you are unlikely to get your money back. And so you do them to try to, as you both said earlier, proof of concept. Can you show that a business might work, and once you've demonstrated it might work, then you can make it more. Then you can try to scale it.
Yeah.
So I think that having those separate pools of capital with different risk tolerances is absolutely fundamental if we're going to solve this problem.
Excellent, excellent. That's very helpful. Jared, let me come back to you. And I think our colleagues from IFAD will be talking about this somehow when they talk about the financing flows for food systems. But the whole discussion today is the mismatch between the supply and demand of the capital that is out there in transforming food systems. If you go to different circles, the amount of money that is available for financing food systems is very limited. And here we are talking about new innovations and models that are coming up. The tracking instrument that IFAD and the World Bank are leading and they were part of is really beginning to show and demonstrate that mismatch. But tell us from the Climate Bonds Initiative, what are you seeing, especially this mismatch? Because I'm hearing different voices. It's not just about lack of money, it's about the nature and the type of money. If you're talking about adaptation to climate change and climate smart, I hear you. What are you seeing from where you are?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the issue that you've highlighted is absolutely a huge issue for getting finance to flow, which is the mismatch in the scale of the needs on the ground and what investors are looking for, which are larger. It's like lumpier money, and then you've got small, disaggregated, small farmers that are looking for financing, and that's where the actual decarbonization and adaptation happens at that scale. So that is a huge challenge, but we have seen some exciting examples and innovative examples, and we need to see more of them. We need to really support that demonstration effect. So a couple of them that come to mind. One, I love to use this example because I found it pretty interesting how they went about this. It was in Mexico. It was a development bank. They're called FIRA. It's an acronym in Spanish that I can't say the Spanish like full name, but they're a development finance institution that focuses on a national one that focuses on agriculture and food sector, and they issued a green bond, which they used to then to offer lines of credit to farmers for protected agriculture, so like greenhouses. Um, but in order to do that, there was a lot of due diligence and a lot of data required. So each of the small farms had to report back on their water usage and a number of metrics. And it's actually a climate bond certified bond, which means it meets really high standards because we are considered kind of the gold standard in terms of the green bond market. So it met these standards, But they did is they basically aggregated. I mean, and that's what banks are. They're actually basically, in some ways, aggregators. And so I think working with banks and seeing these kind of examples with, especially development finance institutions that are motivated by, more than with multiple mandates, right, to actually support development. I think this is a really great example. And there's another example in Brazil that I thought was quite interesting, which was a securitization company. Again, my pronunciation's horrible, but it's Gaia Securitization. And they also support it. So sorry, just one point to note, the FURA bond actually supported capex, but the securitization company was supporting opex. So they were actually helping these farmers with their operational costs and running costs for their farms. So that's another example where I think they worked with 7 medium-sized farms, and then provided loans to them, and then issued a bond to finance those loans. So yeah, there's definitely examples out there, and it's starting to happen. But I think in order to get scale, there's a lot that needs to be done, in terms of definitions, in terms of technical assistance, in terms of blended finance, risk, uh, and reducing the risk through credit enhancements and other types of mechanisms.
Excellent. Excellent. Thanks so much. I am aware that we have to be rushing into other sessions. And really, really, I know there are discussions. There are people who have been sending messages to and questions to all of you. We'll have to get them ready for you. But because of the time challenges, and most of you are speakers in other sessions, I cannot extend this further. I want to really request Joe Puri, who is the Associate Vice President at IFAD. He's the Associate Vice President of Strategy and Knowledge in the International Fund for Agricultural Development, to give us closing remarks before we set off. Madam Joe, you have the floor. Give us the closing comments. Thanks for give a clap of thanks to the panelists, just to demonstrate your appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Boaz. And yeah, it was really an excellent panel, Boaz, and thank you very much to you and to the speakers. Thank you both very much. Also to Ujala and Per and to Nick. So I have the unenviable task of trying to close a very rich panel. What I'm going to try and do is to really try and categorize, I think, what the speakers said, the presenters and the speakers said, into 4 things. And I'm going to call them the 4 Bs. And the 4 Bs are essentially, I think, what are emerging is very critical in the overall financing space for food systems, and trying to address the key gap where we are seeing it with 660 billion is what Kiara said. And we know that into agri-food systems, it's less than 30% of the overall financing that's going. So 4 Bs for me were bundling, blending finance, building a pipeline of bankable projects, and then also ensuring that there's benefit sharing. And the benefit sharing is really where I want to come in on from IFAD's perspective. But really, to what the panelists were talking about, I think what we are hearing is very much that on one side, we clearly need to be looking at the risk appetites and the quality of financing that's coming in, which Nick spoke about very eloquently. But it's clearly important that we are thinking about scale. In the context of scale, one of the key things that IFAD looks at, or the International Fund for Agricultural Development, is how we can truly bring together different kinds of funders with different risk appetites, and put them all together. So we try and do this. We've got what's called an NSO platform, or the Non-Sovereign Operations Platform, where IFAD puts its own, IFAD puts resources that are aggregated from other funders. In the morning, we also did one other event where we are looking at Artifim, which is a new platform, which is the Africa Rural Climate Adaptation Financing Mechanism. And there we are bringing in financiers and funders that include philanthropies as well as bilateral funders that include the Nordic Development Fund, for example, the government of Denmark, GCF, as well as the European Commission, and also some its own resources, and also puts in technical assistance resources, but essentially to create a platform to then go forward and to provide both the assets as well as the capital the OPEX as well as the CAPEX funding for downstream small and medium enterprises, but also um, financial institutions that are much closer to the ground, to rural small scale farmers in the agri food systems. And so we are working through through Equity Bank for both OPEX as well as CAPEX funding. The important thing here is to recognize that financing, although, and this is my second B, also blended financing is clearly important. These are transactions that are difficult to put together, they're difficult to negotiate, and it does require a lot of optimism from all of the financiers and for the downstream actors to really be participating in those spaces. And so, huge credit also to the CG for thinking about how we can create these innovative platforms, both mature commercial investors as well as in the context of far more frontier investments. I think the third thing I want to really talk about is bankability. So while we are talking to a lot of investors who keep coming to us and talk about and want to think about putting in resources and investments in, say, sub-Saharan Africa, and Boaz also spoke about some of the work that we're doing with the World Bank on trying to see as to what kind of bilateral, international, as well as national investments are going on and investment flows that we are witnessing, especially in the agri-food system, and we can talk about that bilaterally. I think one of the key things that we're discovering is that although there may be some appetite, once you start to think about the risk, return, and impact triumvirate, right? So it's not just the risk and return; it is the risk, return, and impact triumvirate. That pipeline of bankable projects actually becomes very, very short, right? And that's primarily because you require people and boots on the ground to really be able to do the parallel or the analog of what's called your know your customer, your KYC work, your due diligence work, to understand risk appetites, to understand riskiness, to understand the requirements for collateral. And then we depend on our partners that are really closer to the ground, but also our country offices to do that due diligence to create that bankable, that pipeline of bankable projects. And the fourth part, the B of the four Bs that I want to talk about is benefit sharing. I think one of the key things that gets left out in a lot of their thinking is, well, what about the people who are truly investing in making our globe resilient? It is the small scale producers, it is the rural households that actually ensure that they are adopting, say, agroforestry systems. Small scale producers, and the evidence has shown this incontrovertibly, are far more likely to adopt agroforestry, agrobiodiversity, nature based solutions than large scale solo plantations. With the result, we need to be able to ensure that we are able to use a lot of our resources and our returns on ensuring that the small scale producers and rural farmers are getting some of those benefits. And that's where the credibility of what we are doing is really key. So, whether it is looking at the proceeds of green bonds or whether it is looking at the extent to which we are truly investing in opportunities on the ground that are leading to increased resilience, the last thing I'm going to say here is that EFAD is really proud because we actually use impact assessments to measure the overall results of our investments. And that's how we've also been able to list our bonds most recently at the London Stock Exchange. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everybody.